Hello, and welcome to CRPS Contender, my complex regional pain syndrome education channel. Today's video is Emotional Outsourcing, Adaptations and Addiction. This video is part of my Narrow Mind Till the Soul Begins to Break, CRPS, a biopsychosocial developmental disorder series. In this series, I will be discussing CRPS Contender's personal hypothesis about why CRPS happens and the type of individual it happens to, and what mitigating efforts can be made to counteract the effects of CRPS based on that understanding. Let's hop right into the content here. There are three major models of addiction in modern society at this time. I am going to focus on one of them, but I do want to at least bring the other two to your attention so that you're aware of them. First is the choice model, where addiction is seen as a moral failing of the individual to resist a temptation or a craving. I'm not really going to give this any more of my attention because I think it's completely bogus and the evidence absolutely supports that. So moving right on, the disease model. The disease model views addiction as a chronically relapsing brain disease with a genetic or biochemical cause. The biomedical or disease model of addiction views addiction as a manifestation of disturbances in measurable biochemical or neurophysiological processes in the afflicted individual. And third is the biopsychosocial model. The available evidence suggests that biological, genetic, personality, psychological, cognitive, social, cultural, and environmental factors interact to produce the substance use disorder, and multiple factors must be addressed in the prevention and treatment programs. The interaction of these factors to produce substance use problems is the core tenet of the biopsychosocial model of addiction. And this biopsychosocial model, as you probably have guessed, is the one that I am going to focus on today. I had actually quite a difficult time trying to come up with exactly how I wanted to do this particular video because I am not an addiction expert. So I'm going to be pulling a lot from the actual experts. And so most of these direct quotes on the slides are pulled from other experts. You're welcome to check out the source sheets for any of these. A lot of my view has been influenced by Dr. Gabor Mate, who I have mentioned in other videos. Dr. Mate ran the first safe injection site in Canada and has worked with the addict community for many years and has written several books on the topic. So most of the actual quotes on my slides today, I am pulling from him and other related experts. I'm going to obviously kind of talk about my own thoughts and spin and stuff on that, but that's mostly where this is coming from. Dr. Gabor Mate defines addiction as: addiction manifests as any behavior used to temporarily find pleasure or relief from pain, which one craves and pursues despite the negative consequences. This definition is not restricted to drugs, but could encompass almost any human behavior. Dr. Mate says that addiction is neither a choice nor a disease, but originates in a human being's desperate attempt to solve a problem. The problem of emotional pain, of overwhelming stress, of lost connection, of lost control, of a deep discomfort with the self. In short, addiction is a forlorn attempt to solve the problem of human pain. With that understanding, let's talk a little bit more about addiction. Dr. Mate's mantra in his work is, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. The source of pain is always and invariably to be found in a person's lived experience, beginning with childhood. Childhood trauma is the template for addiction, any addiction, whether that is shopping addiction, a gambling addiction, a video game addiction, a sex addiction, substance addiction, an alcohol addiction, cigarette addiction, any sort of addiction whatsoever. All addictions are attempts to escape the deep pain of the hurt child, attempts that are temporarily soothing, but ultimately futile. Not only is the urge to escape pain shared by all addicts, substance users or not, the same brain circuits are involved in all addictions. The same brain circuits, the same brain systems involving pleasure, reward, and incentive, the same neurochemicals, not to mention the same emotional dynamics of shame and lack of self-worth, and the behaviors of denial and dishonesty and subterfuge. We as a society do ourselves a great disservice by labeling substance users as the only addicts. I'm sure you can see, based on this understanding of addiction, that most human beings at one time or another have engaged in some sort of addictive behavior and addictive patterning, and it is not limited solely to substance use and abuse. So why does addiction happen? What is the innate human condition that causes addictive behaviors to arise? Emotional outsourcing. Addiction is neither a choice nor an inherited disease, but a psychological and physiological response to painful life experiences. Not all traumatized people become addicts, but all addicted people were traumatized at some point, in some way. Trauma is not restricted to horrific life experiences. Trauma refers to any set of events that, over time, impose more pain on the child than their sensitive organism can process and discharge. Therefore, trauma can occur not only when bad things happen, but also when the parents do not respond to the sensitive child's emotional needs to be seen, emotionally held, heard, validated, and made to feel secure. This can be for many reasons. This can be due to economic hardship, this can be due to stress, this can be due to some sort of disease or neglect or abuse. It could be many reasons, but whatever the reason is, the child is not receiving that emotional security and validation to be able to learn how to regulate their own internal emotional state. And because they cannot regulate it internally, they look for something outside of themselves to help relieve their pain or to spark some sort of pleasurable sensation. With that understanding, addiction is not the problem. Addiction is the adaptation to the problem of trauma. A traumatic event has two parts. There's the initial external event, and then there's the internal impact to that event. The actual trauma is the disconnect from the self because it is too painful to be aware of your own gut feelings and emotions. The disconnection of the gut-brain pathway in the body is the trauma itself. And as a result of this disconnection from our own feelings and emotions, we spend the rest of our lives compensating for this loss by developing a personality. This personality is an adaptation to cover our vulnerabilities and our raw wounds, which allows us to attain the love that we could not obtain in the first place, which would have allowed us to connect to ourselves. When temporary states in response to stress become long-term traits, that's when the trouble really starts. And what began as an adaptation ends as an illness. Usually, these states that become traits are in response to pain, fear, or terror. But pain, fear, and terror are not inherently bad to experience. They are, in fact, quite important to our continued survival. However, they become negative if you do not have the means to digest these experiences, to understand them, and to put them into context. When you cannot do that, you look for things outside of yourselves to relieve your suffering. And that is addiction. What are my thoughts on what CRPS patients in particular are addicted to? Adrenaline. Long before I developed CRPS, I was a self-professed adrenaline junkie. And if my hypothesis is correct, I imagine many, if not all of you, will relate to this. In brief, addiction is a cycle of craving, relief, pleasure, suffering, and impaired control leading back to craving again. This is not a matter of a free will, which is what the choice model implies, but instead it is a matter of a free won't, due to impaired control from prefrontal cortex disinhibition. The prefrontal cortex is something that develops over time and is in fact one of the last areas to fully mature in the human brain. This is a matter of development, and if you don't learn how to connect to that area of your brain and create those pathways and begin the self-regulatory aspects that the prefrontal cortex is supposed to do, you won't be able to say no. You won't be able to inhibit yourself and stop yourself and enforce your self-regulation and self-control because your prefrontal cortex is not working correctly in the network with the rest of your brain. So you can't inhibit the impulses of, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want it now, I'm going to get it. Whatever it takes, whatever is necessary, because you are so desperate for a relief from your internal state. Adrenaline addiction is about maximum fear arousal and constant pressure. Adrenaline junkies are a subset of people who crave stimulation and thrive in environments that would seem overstimulating or even chaotic to the rest of us. A lot of people who are not adrenaline junkies feel like high sensation seekers do reckless things. Interestingly, the seekers themselves often don't perceive the things that they do as reckless because their bodies are telling them that it doesn't feel dangerous. So what's going on in the body in response to that subconscious need for adrenaline? In the presence of perceived danger to life and limb, our adrenal glands pump out large amounts of adrenaline, which is closely related to the neurotransmitter dopamine, the chemical messenger in the brain that plays a major role in pleasure and addiction. Danger also triggers the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus to secrete endorphins, the pain-suppressing and pleasure-inducing compounds that are mimicked by opiates, including heroin. The effect of these stimulants, such as cocaine or amphetamines, which is speed, is to flood the brain with dopamine. An adrenaline high is very similar. To get a high that's beyond what you could get with drugs, you have to put your life on the line. People can become addicted to the risk and may have to keep raising the limits to get the reward that they're seeking. The important thing to note is that adrenaline does not mask pain, which is why you can be having massive sympathetic activity with major amounts of adrenaline in the system and still be experiencing great amount of pain during CRPS. What adrenaline does is it diverts an individual's concentration away from the pain to something else entirely, giving him or her the feeling that the pain no longer exists at all. What happens when no matter the amount of adrenaline that's in your system, you can't ignore the pain any longer because it is too insistent, which is what happens in CRPS. There's a phrase I used in one of my previous videos about adrenaline junkies and how you know that you're stressed, but you don't know that you're stressed. I understand that can be a confusing statement, so I want to talk a little bit about dissociation and shame. Dissociation is a highly creative, adaptive coping strategy in an environment that is dangerous and chaotic. In the face of trauma, we employ this protective strategy to try to unknow that which is too terrifying to integrate. When our internal alarm system is activated, we have 3 healthy options available to us. We can fight back, we can run away and remove ourselves from the threat, or we can, as a social creature, ask someone else for help. But what happens when you're in a situation when you can't fight back, you can't run away, and no one will help you? That is where dissociation comes in. Your sympathetic activity is activated, and your parasympathetic system, the system that is generally responsible for rest and relaxation and safety, comes in and clamps down hard on your sympathetic activity. So you have both systems activated simultaneously. And that is dissociation. Dissociation is learned early. The critical underlying issue is that these patients don't know how to feel safe. If your caregivers ignore your needs or resent your very existence, you learn how to anticipate rejection and withdrawal. You cope as well as you can by blocking out your mother's hostility or neglect and act as if it doesn't matter. But your body remains in a state of high alert, prepared to ward off blows, deprivation, or abandonment. Dissociation means simultaneously knowing and not knowing. And that is from The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. And that is exactly what I mean by both knowing and not knowing that you're stressed. The autonomic nervous system, which is one of the major areas that CRPS affects, which consists of your sympathetic, parasympathetic systems, Your autonomic nervous system does not make decisions. It just runs patterns. And if the patterns that your body has learned is to constantly be in a state of alarm because you do not feel safe, you are going to experience dissociation, more likely than not, where you don't necessarily know that you're stressed because you don't want to know. It's too terrifying to integrate that sensation, so you consciously are not aware of it. But your body is very aware, and it remains in the state of high adrenaline activity with lots of sympathetic activity, and that's the pattern that it has learned. And that is the pattern that becomes deeply, deeply ingrained in the body. And until the body can start to feel safe and wanted, it does not matter what kind of psychological, cognitive behavioral therapy you are doing, because that's all happening in your cortex. But the problem here is in the brainstem and the limbic system. And if you cannot change the patterns in the body, in the brainstem and the limbic system, the body response will not change. So it is very important that in your attempts to deal with your CRPS, you are focusing a large amount of your attention on making sure that the body feels safe, secure, and wanted, regardless of what is happening externally. Now, I want to talk a little bit, just a touch, about shame. I am going to have a completely another video on this. I'm going to have another one on dissociation too, but I'm only going to briefly touch on this. Dissociation and shame are about sympathetic and parasympathetic activity happening simultaneously. Shame is about disconnection from love before having done anything wrong. When we reconnect with love, we are overcoming shame. The answer to shame is love. If my hypothesis is correct, I imagine most of you are dealing with a deeply ingrained sense of shame and lack of worth. The answer to this is to learn how to love yourself and give yourself your own worth. And that is easy to say and very hard to do. But when you feel shamed, you will start to dissociate, because that is the pattern. That is the same biological function that is occurring. You have your sympathetic activity, your parasympathetic activity comes down to clamp down hard on it to make it stop. You feel shame, you start to dissociate. And when you are dissociating, you cannot integrate anything, which is not going to fix the problem and will in fact make it worse. Now, it might in the short term help you to dissociate because you can't tolerate the pain. You can't handle it. I understand. But until you can learn to sit with your own emotions and not run from them, you cannot begin to regulate your own internal state. You will not be able to handle the addiction. And so it will create a vicious cycle. The longer you're in it, the harder it is to get out of. Healing, quite literally, means wholeness. And wholeness happens when we reconnect with ourselves. That's where I'm going to leave this video today. I'm going to have another video about pain, pleasure, fear, and joy. That's the next one. And then the one after that will be about personality, ego, persona, and our patterns. Those are both going to relate to the things that we talked about in this video today, so keep an eye out for them. Today, we covered the 3 major models of viewing addiction, defining addiction as a response to human suffering, not why the addiction, but why the pain, emotional outsourcing, addiction as an adaptation, adrenaline junkies, reckless behavior and relentless drive, and dissociation and shame. Thank you so much for watching. You're welcome to share any content I create on this channel. If you like what I'm doing here, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. If you'd like to contribute to my medical expenses, my Patreon is listed below. As always, relevant sources are linked in the description. I hope you learned something today, and I hope to see you next time.